Well, good morning, everybody. How is everybody doing today? Glad to be with you. By the way, if this is your first time joining the Q&A live youth ministry questions here, my name is Paul Turner, and I am from the discipleproject.net. So I just want to start with that. If you're a regular here, you know that I try to come to you every Wednesday. Now it's every Thursday, where we get together and we ask some questions about youth ministry and excuse me. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about all. I hope you all had great youth meetings last night, by the way. I got to sit and hang out with my friend Adam in his youth ministry, and he crushed it. He did a great job teaching on the atonement. Did a super job at that, and was just a good time hanging with that, and lots of other good things happening in the world of youth ministry. And but today I want to talk about what a question from a friend of mine, John Rogers, and he asked the question. He says, He wants to talk about recruiting. Excuse me. He wants to talk about basically recruiting small group, and he puts in parentheses, not Sunday school, and recruiting small group leaders and starting a small group ministry. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement there, but I thought it's a good topic because it's still fall. January will be coming up. Everybody wanting to maybe change a few things in their ministry, and hopefully I can maybe add a little bit of value to that. Excuse me, let me have a little coffee. Now, so when talking about John's question here about small group, by the way, feel free to just let me know how your youth meeting, if you're live, by the way, hopefully you're live with me, and I do see some people in the chat there. By the way, you can also, if you're interested in doing so, you don't have to do this, but in the chat box on the right here, if you enjoy doing these chats here, you can really you can support what I do, because all this, by the way, is free. If you haven't noticed, I give away a lot of free stuff, whether it's free videos, free blog posts, free advice, all that kind of good stuff. So if you're interested at all in supporting what I do and you enjoy the talks that I do, I'm going to show you here where to the right here, or to my left maybe, there's the chat box where you can actually, excuse me, where you can actually support what I do. So if you would like to, you're welcome to do so. But in the chat box there is on the bottom, on the bottom left, there's a little dollar sign. You can see that there. Maybe it's down on the bottom there, bottom left. And there's a little that says, show your support for Paul Turner. And you can actually give $5 if you like, and say, look, I like what Paul's doing. Here's $5, Paul. Good job, kiddo. Thanks for coming up, waking up early in the morning, taking notes, and joining us to share with us some of your 30 years of youth ministry experience and how that can benefit my youth ministry, me and my church and so forth. So you're welcome to do that. So, and be sure to ask questions as we go along, especially if you're here talking about small groups, things like that. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat there. So I hope that you will take advantage of those things to be able to engage in the conversation. Otherwise, it's just me talking, and that's not always great. We want to really have conversations versus me just being a talking head talking to the screen, which is not. It's not super great to do all the time. I'd rather have a conversation. So, jumping into John's question, let me reiterate the question. I would like to know about recruiting small group, not Sunday school, leaders and starting a small group ministry. Thank you, John, for your question. Now, I appreciate how John separates a Sunday school leader versus a small group leader, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But I think the first question you have to ask is this. What is a small group ministry versus having small groups? Okay, and how does this differ? If it was a follow-up question, how does this differ from Sunday school? Because you may already have small groups happening, right? In your youth ministry, you may have a drama team, you may have the band, you already may have some sort of service team or leadership team, and all of those are small groups. So there's small groups, and most of those small groups have leaders. The band has a leader. Your servant team has a leader. Your drama team has a leader. Those are all small groups that are very specific, right? But I think having a small group ministry is very, very different than having small groups. Each small groups, right? Churches and youth ministries can have small groups, but they don't necessarily have a small group ministry. And I think you have to be first define what that is. What is a small group ministry? Because I know it's catchy, right? It's a great catchphrase to say, well, we have a small group ministry. Well, what does that mean exactly? And how does that differ from a youth group or that has small groups versus having a small group ministry? How is that different? And I think once you, and then the second part of the question is, how is that different from maybe Sunday schools? Because I think many people think of small groups as, simply another Bible teaching time, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I'm saying is, if you're going to have small groups, that's another Bible teaching time, then why do you need Sunday school? And you know what I'm saying? Because you're doing the same thing. You're essentially having the same people. If you have the same people in church, some of these are going to be teaching Sunday school, and some of these same people may be teaching in your small groups. And so when you're considering that, and you're considering the difference between that, I think you really have to really define: are you a youth group that has small groups, or are you or are you dialing in on small group ministry? And once again, I can't define all that for you. These are questions that you're going to have to ask of your ministry. But I would say that there is a difference between a youth group that has small groups. Maybe you do the message, and then you break out and you have small groups that discuss the message. Now, that's not necessarily, I would not necessarily call that a small group ministry. I would say that's a youth ministry that has small groups, right? That has an opportunity to break down into those things. And so, you can ask yourself, what's the difference between having small groups and having a small group ministry? I think small group ministry is far more defined as to why, and that's the other, question is why do I want to have small group? Why do I want to have small group ministry or even small groups? I understand the value of that, of saying, I understand the value of small groups. So it's not like saying, well, should you not do small groups? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is understanding what its individual purpose is in having small groups. Because listen, youth ministry is like anything else. It can be trendy. It can be some of the churches doing that, so we should have that because we have small group ministry. I think God has an individual plan for individual churches, right? I think when we start getting over into other reasons why we want to do things, I think we need to do things because it meets the needs of the people that are attending, or it is there to challenge them to step up into a different spiritual growth mode. And so I think you have to really define, what that is for your ministry. Ask, why do I want to have this? Why do I want to have this ministry? Is it because it's trendy? Is it because my kids need it? And that's when you get into the question of, okay, do I want to have small groups as a part of this, or do I want to have a small group ministry? And what does that difference look like for you? And then I think you have to ask, what is the purpose of your small groups, right? If you already have Sunday school and you already have kind of an educational piece to that, then why do you need more small groups, right? If there's already a place to do it on Sunday mornings, let's say, and you're saying, okay, we're going to have Sunday school on Sunday mornings, and that meets a particular need, then why do I need more small groups? Or why do I need small group ministry, and does it replace Sunday school, or does it have a different facet, or a different facet than Sunday school, right? In other words, are your small groups there because you have a high percentage of kids who deal with addictions? So maybe your small group looks like a recovery, right? A recovery group for teens. Is it a Bible study? This is a Bible study group, and we're going to be going through X. Is it topics of the day, right? Is it specific to that says we're going to cover what's going on in our world and how do we navigate these issues that are in life, right? So I think you have to define what is the purpose of our small groups. You say, can it be all of those, Paul? And I would probably say no, it can't. I think you have to be super dialed in to what is the purpose of these. Whether you have small groups, what is the purpose? Like if you say we're breaking up into small groups after the message, the entire purpose of breaking up into small groups after a message maybe is to find application to what was just spoken. How do I live that out? And those questions are defined by what the message was. So those small groups have a purpose. If you say, well, we're going to have small group ministry, then that, I think, is an entirely different thing. That's where you start getting into things like recovery, or you feel like that small groups versus a me get up and preach, and then break into small groups, that basically you enter in and you're coming into small groups that small groups are the thing. That, in other words, there maybe isn't a big group dynamic, or maybe the big group dynamic happens after small groups, right? So everybody comes in, finds a small group, then there's a gathering time, not necessarily for a message, maybe an encouragement, and maybe a time of prayer or just corporate worship, right? So, what is then the purpose of these small groups? So if you're going to start that, I would stay away from the trendiness. I would stay away from those kind of things and really dig down into the purpose of why you want to have them. Is it on the heart of other people? In other words, do you have other people? Do you sense a resonance in other people when you're talking about that small groups need to be a thing of how we do ministry? Is it small group ministry, or do we just need to have a couple of small groups to identify or to meet a need within our group? The third thing is, what is the outcome, right? If a kid goes through this small group for 4 years, let's say, what do you hope is the outcome of those 4 years, right? What is the outcome of that time they're going to spend there? In other words, is there a goal? Let's put it this way, if the purpose of education, if it's education, let's say, you say, well, I want to make sure that our kids go through the Old and New Testament in 4 years. Okay, well, that's a clear outcome that you have covered Scripture from Genesis to Revelation through these 4 years, and that is clearly defined. Now, Sunday school might do that, or you say, well, no, I want to do it this way. If you say, if your small group is geared towards recovery, well, then obviously you would see kids coming out of that. The goal is they're coming out of an addiction. Excuse me. They're coming out of addiction, and they're embracing Christ, and they're on a new journey, and they're on a new path of life. They're finding Christ. It's a place where new kids who don't know Jesus can come in with their addiction, talk about that thing, whatever that is, and then then make it an outreach of sorts that says we want to reach kids on the fringes who are dealing with addictions, whether it's alcohol or drugs or pornography or whatever that may be. And they come in to this group because they want to do that, and they eventually find Christ. And the hope and the outcome of that is that kids find Christ and deliverance from their addictions and freedom from their addictions. Defining the outcomes is a strong way to define then what goes into your small groups, right? What goes into those small groups affects your outcome. If you say, I want this to be my outcome, but I am planning differently and you're getting different outcomes, then that's a problem. And that goes back to, why do I want to have small groups? What's the purpose of these small groups? And what will be the outcomes then? So you then have to define those things. And that's just the hard work, guys. We can't just ramp it up and say, hey, we're going to have small groups, guys, or we're going to have a small group ministry. I think there needs to be a depth of prayer and a depth of considerations, and not just getting in our little lab and cooking something up that will just be a hotness, right? A newness, a new thing, without giving it careful consideration. That's true of any program, of anything you want to start. I think you have to have some clear guidelines as to why you want to start something. What are the outcomes? How am I planning this to reach those outcomes and be able to do some of those things? The fourth thing I would say in in deciding small groups is, well, how will you separate them? And I think this is becoming it's becoming a more and more important topic in the day in which we live, because we initially, right, we say, well, we're gonna separate kids by grade, age, gender, mixed together by school. There'll be guys and girls in there. But will there be separate guy time and girl time? Will this be? And once again, this can be done throughout. If you're saying, well, this is a solid thing, and this is the way that's going to look out throughout the whole year. And by the way, you can plan according to semester, or you can plan the whole year, which I think helps develop your outcomes. If you do a year-long plan, you're able to see further down the road and say, how do we get to this outcome? How do we get there? Is it best? Are kids best served? And once again, this depends on the makeup of your group, right? It's hard to say, well, I'm gonna have separate by gender, and you have 2 girls and 5 guys. Now, 5 guys is a small group. The girls are 2 girls. That's a small group. Nothing wrong with that. But I think the aesthetics of it, when, in our minds, when we think small groups, we say, well, we have 5 or 7 kids there. We have 7 to 5, we have 6 to 8 kids there. We have it in kind of our minds of what this, large size. And I think you have to go with what you have, right? And maybe, once again, if your youth group is 5 to 7 kids, you have a small group, right? And you can define what that is throughout the year then, right? That's a different thing. I said, well, Paul, aren't we supposed to do outreach? Well, here's the deal. Is small group ministry, is it in-house or is it outreach? Well, it's both, Paul. I don't know. Is it? Because I think how you gear those discussions depends on who's in that small group and what that small group is willing to do, right? In other words, they might not want to reach out. This may be an in-house thing, because if you have 5 to 7 kids in your group and you're having a small group time, they're not necessarily maybe interested in having more people or splitting groups or doing any of those things, right? Those are our ideas. Those are our youth ministry training, or somebody said something in a conference. I watched this on YouTube, whatever it is. I think it's just a matter of saying, what is going to work? How does it meet? How does small groups or a small group ministry facilitate the gospel within the context of our youth ministry? Because it doesn't matter, by the way, and I've suffered this for 30 years, is the fact of there are people who are not going to want to go in that small group. There are going to be people who are not sold on it. There's people who don't want to hang out with those people. There's people who are going to want to, I'm this age, but I'm in this grade. Those are all things you're going to have to deal with, right? Those are things that you're going to have to draw up with parents, more than likely, if you're making a shift in ministry, in a paradigm of ministry. Make sure that you're communicating this with your pastor, your parents. You need to have a very long intro to launching this, because you want to get feedback from all the various people who are going to be affected by this. It can't just be, hey, we're doing small groups, and then boom, it's in your face, now deal with it. I just think you have to do a little bit more homework on that. And back to what I was saying earlier, how will you separate them? I just read this morning on a post where a boy who was transgendered went into the church, and it was a small group night, I guess, and wound up going over to the girls' group. Well, there you go. If you're going to separate by gender, guys, girls, whatever, you're going to have to make these decisions. And I believe those are going to happen more and more. And by the way, I think anybody should be able to show up for youth group. Everybody should be able to come to the church. Everybody should have an opportunity to know Christ and be in community. It is not the fault of the person who's coming into your group that we don't have either a policy or in other words, we should be prepared to receive anybody who walks through the door. It is not the person's fault walking the door that we're in a dilemma. We're in a dilemma because we've not done the homework, and we say, well, what is our policy, or what does our church think about this, or what, it doesn't matter. If the attitude that anybody can come, then you're going to have to make some decisions on who walks through that door and have answers ready for that, right? I believe the book was recommended, How to Minister to LGBTQ Students, as part of the discussion there, and I'll put a link down in the description below if you're looking for a book to read on that. I'll probably do a little review of that at some point. But, in that book, it just gives you ways of doing ministry to people who do not fit, within the context of our normal ministry paradigms. And I think Jesus was really good at that. And we're not so great at that because we don't have a plan. We don't think it through. We don't have things that we're going to, the challenges of the world within we live. We don't already have a plan ready to go, and we should really have a plan to do that. So, when you're studying that and looking at that, how will you separate them? How will you separate the groups? And do you have enough to facilitate that? Is it okay that your 7th grade boys has 2 kids in it? Is it okay that you do it by grade and you do it by 11th grade girls? Is it okay that, what are you going to do with one? Do they join the 10th grade, right, group? Or do they go up and say, I'm going to put this in the 12th grade? Or is it 11th and 12th grade, 8th and 9th, 10th and 11th, 12th? And you're going to have to figure all that out. You're just going to have to figure that out based on what you have. And then if somebody comes in, and what if somebody invites somebody and they're a grade older or a grade younger? Do they get to go with the guest that they have? Or is there an understanding that if you bring somebody a grade older or younger or 2 grades, whatever it is, they're going to have to go to their small group of their age? That's just how we do things, because that's how we do things. And that's good. Once again, how are you going to separate them? You're going to have to discuss that. And the 5th and final thing is this. Well, I say 5th and final, but there's going to be a bonus one here. I just want to let you know, hang around this little bonus here. What kind of leader can lead this group? And I like how John dissects or discerns the difference between Sunday school and small group, because I think Sunday school and small group are different, right? I think there's a teacher, and I think there's a facilitator. And I think a small group leader, if you're talking about small group ministry, and once again, that's defined on how you do it. If you say, look, I want to do Bible instruction, well, then you're maybe looking for a teacher. If you're talking about having discussions on recovery or a place for a kid to kind of dump themselves out into discussions, topics of the day, then maybe you're looking for a facilitator who does not have to take control of a meeting or lead the small group, but rather leaves time for discussion and opens it up where silence is okay, right? Where silence is okay in that small group. And I think you have to, once again, can you do small groups if you have X amount of leaders? And what kind of leaders? Now, you're going to find leaders who naturally bend towards facilitate. Do you have those kind of leaders who can facilitate? Or do you have a bunch of teachers? Or, and once again, the leaders may define what kind of small groups you're going to have. Otherwise, you're going to train a bunch of people who are teachers to be better facilitators. And that's our role, right? As youth leaders, we have to find those people to do that. And I love what Chad Higgins talks about. I had Chad Higgins on my podcast, and he talks about developing small group leaders. I want to put a link to that in the description below. I want to encourage you to listen to that, because he talks about, he talks about training up small group leaders, and he talks about, that small group leaders, especially if you're if you have small group ministry, that you want your leaders to be empathetic. Now, can teachers be empathetic? Yes. But if you hand somebody and you say, here's the lesson, let's say, then teachers maybe are geared towards finishing the lesson versus or disseminating information versus it's okay if I don't finish everything as long as I am facilitating discussion, as long as I'm facilitating letting kids share, ask questions. It's okay if we go off a little off topic, because there's some small group leaders who, they want a certain kind of meeting or a certain kind of group. And that's our job to make sure that all our small group leaders understand what their role is within a small group ministry. And that's our job to teach and train that. But I'm going to put a link down below because he really talks about, having guys who are teachers versus leaders or leaders versus facilitators, the kind of people that we have in those things. Once again, it's not either or in a sense. You can be a teacher and a great facilitator. What I'm saying is that will those small groups and the personalities that you have in those groups be driven to finish the lesson, or are they empathetically listening to what's happening in the group there so that they can be able to minister to them, not out of the curriculum, but out of their hearts? And so that's kind of the deal with that, is you want to make sure that you're choosing those leaders wisely. Do I have the correct leadership or the correct personalities to lead the kind of small groups that I want to have? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And a lot of that has to do with your church's evangelism. Are we bringing in new people? Do I have a strategy for recruitment? Am I looking, and it doesn't matter. You can have older, younger, male, female, it doesn't matter. As long as you have a certain kind of personality that can facilitate the outcomes that you want to see. Now, I would say the last thing is, what will be your material? So I will say this is the bonus part here, is what kind of material are you going to teach? Is it going to be an orange XP3? Is it going to be a homebrew thing that I have this? And that's going to be important, because if small group ministry is the thing, then you're going to have a 4-year outcome to that, right? That you say, I want to have small group ministry, and here's the outcome. If I say, look, I just want to have small groups, that may not, the material may not matter as much, because, it still matters. I don't want to say it, but it's not going to matter in the sense of a 4-year outcome. I would give my leaders, like I said, if it's post-message, you say we're going to have small groups to talk about the message, okay, there you go. I already know what my message is. I've given you 5 questions. Go with it. And here's the outcome. Here's the hope of the outcome of what it is you're doing with the small groups. And, or if you're saying, look, no, we're doing Celebrate Recovery with teenagers, or we're doing biblical knowledge takeaway stuff. Okay, well, what's going to be the curriculum for that? That's something that you really have to think through and pray through. And say, well, what am I going to use? You could, now there are some groups, who go over the same. If it's let's say you're separating guys and girls, maybe you have the same 5 questions, maybe for a semester. And by the way, before you launch your thing, you might want to just say, this is experimental. We're trying this, right? Now, if it's a small group ministry, say we're moving to small group ministry, maybe you have to say, look, this is a long-term deal, but we are going to be tweaking it the first year. We're tweaking things. Just know that this is not how it's always going to be forever and ever. We are starting with this, and we're moving forward, making little changes as we go. But let me give you an example. So if I took, if you're doing discipleship, okay? Now, for those who are not familiar, I wrote a book called The Disciple Project, if you've never seen it before, and I'll put a link down there in the doobly-doo below if you're interested in this. But I was thinking about that if I was doing this, if I was focused on discipleship, based on the 5 core values of a disciple that I have in here, I would say, okay, what are my questions for that, right? And you can go back to, I think John Wesley has the 5 questions or 6 questions that he would ask in a small group, or ask of men. I can't remember the context for that, but he had the same, maybe 5 or 6 small group. But if I find that, I'm going to put that down in the description below as well. But here's some questions that if I was basing it on this program right here, and say I'm focused on discipleship, and the 5 core, attitudes or behaviors of a disciple, according to Scripture, are sacrifice, surrender, separation, study, okay, and spirit. So if I were to say, take those 5 questions and say, okay, here's what this is going to look like. Every week we're asking the same 5 questions. You know the 5 questions are coming. Here's our scripture, and then here's the 5 questions, or here's how this connects with the message. But here's basically saying and this may not fit into the category of small group ministry as far as long term, because maybe you don't ask the same 5 questions for 4 years straight, although that would be interesting. But as a small group quarterly thing, as part of small group ministry, maybe your quarters look different. This is a biblical quarter. This is an outreach quarter. However you define this, right? It can be tweaked to do certain things. So example, here's, if I was using sacrifice, and how is that manifested? That's love. Who was your biggest struggle to love this week, and why? And what did you have to give up in order to love that person? So that's a standard question, because it is the metric of all Christianity, is love. Did you love somebody, and what were you willing to give up to love them? That's your enemy. That's people. It's, once again, easy to love people you know, harder to love your enemy, harder to love people you don't like, harder to love people that annoy you. So what did you do, right? That's a question. The second thing is this: how did you show humility this week? And that's the core value of surrender, right? How did you show humility this week? That's you have to humble yourself. You have to take up your cross. You have to die to yourself. Well, humility is a core value of discipleship, because every day you're going to have to give up something and humble yourself in some way to serve somebody, to do something maybe you don't necessarily want to do, or to take a loss instead of fight for the win. You might have to take a loss, take an L in the L column there, because that's the appropriate thing to do. Because instead of fighting with that person, I'm going to humble myself and shut my mouth and say, you know what? I don't have to win this argument. I don't have to fight. So that would be a question, right? And was it easy or hard? These are open-ended questions, but they're focused around a certain thing. So I hope you know kind of where I'm going with this, that these are facilitation questions that gear their heads and their brains that week to week, they know they're going to get a certain amount of questions or the same kind of questions in the meeting, and they're going to do that for 12 weeks. It's a short-term deal. Once again, you could do that for a year, but I think that might get a little monotonous. The third question is, how are you different from your surroundings this week? And that's based on separation, which is manifested through holy living, right? I am not like everybody around me because I'm a Christian, because of what Christ has done in my life. There's a difference between me and the rest of the world. How did you show that? How did you separate yourself from the surrounding? Now, that could be music. That could be some cultural thing. That could be worldly behavior, like somebody's gossiping and I walked away. These are practical things, right? The fourth question is, how did you show persistence in your walk with God this week? And that's the word study. And studies, study to show thyself approved isn't necessarily about academics. It's about persistence. It's about grab hold of these things. Hold on to my teachings, right? Hold on and don't let go. Be persistent in your walk with me. So the question is, where did you show persistence in your walk with God this week? Where did you give up too soon, right? It was hard, but I did it, right? And the last thing is, talking about the flesh and spirit, where did your flesh, your way of doing things show up? And where did you sense the Holy Spirit leading you this week? Was it leading you to serve somebody? Was the Holy Spirit reminding you of who you are in Christ? Did the Holy Spirit remind you of something this week, right? Being led by the Spirit versus being led by our flesh. And so, whether it is a curriculum of lessons, whether it's one sheet of questions, of just questions post-message, whether it's a quarterly cycle thing of these 5 questions here. Those are all dynamics of having small groups, and then saying, well, expanding that, is this small group ministry? In other words, are we not having the big kahooey thing maybe once a month we have that, and 3 weeks we have small groups. Maybe every week we have small groups, and then you know, at the end of the month we have a big meeting or something like that. And that's all has to be defined by you guys. You have to be able to break that down if you're going to have successful small groups or having a successful small group ministry. Those are questions you're just going to have to work through. And so I hope this morning that you got some good information here today. If you did, thank you for showing up. I would appreciate it if you guys would give some thumbs up, right? Hit the thumbs up button. Let's know you like the video and you want more of them. That somehow, once again, there's nobody watching this who doesn't like a little pat on the back occasion and says, hey, good job, Paul, right? Everybody likes to hear that. So thumbs up is your way of doing that. You can, once again, hit the little dollar sign there and say, look, I'll give you $1, Paul. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. You could leave a comment. Once again, I love comments. Hey, Jay. Glad you're here this morning. Glad you enjoyed the briefing this morning, the little teaching we have here. And also you can, like I said, leave a comment down below and tell me what is your situation with small groups? Do you have small groups or do you have a small group ministry? I would like to hear your ideas on how you separate that, on you know, what is your, if you don't have small groups. Oh, good. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. Hey, Aaron, thank you. Here's my virtual pat on the back. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that very much. But that's it, guys. I want to thank you guys for tuning in for a little while. I hope it was super helpful for you. I hope you took notes, all that kind of good stuff. There'll be some links down below once all this kind of uploads and all that stuff. And don't forget to share it with somebody. Maybe you need to share this with your leaders or something like that and watch it again with them and say, okay, here's how we're doing the breakdown. Here's how we're doing some of those things. Don't be afraid to share it with your leaders and watch it with them and go through the process with them. You don't have to do this on your own. All right, that's it for today, guys. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me for a while, and I will catch you guys next Thursday. We'll talk to you guys later.